Are you ready to pack your bags and explore the world? Well, think twice because these destinations might turn you away in 2025. Discover the 10 countries where Americans aren't exactly rolling out the welcome mat. Traveling is one of life's greatest joys, but international relations, cultural misunderstandings, and political tensions can sometimes create barriers. Today, we're diving into 10 countries where Americans face challenges, restrictions, or outright bans in 2025. From visa complications to outright hostility, we'll explore why these nations are less friendly to U.S. travelers and what you need to know before you go. Country number 10. North Korea is often described as the most secretive and isolated country in the world. The U.S. government has enforced a strict travel ban for its citizens since 2017, which remains active in 2025. The country operates under a highly authoritarian regime, with strict surveillance on all visitors, especially foreigners. American tourists face constant monitoring by government-assigned guides, leaving no room for personal exploration. The risk of arrest is high, even for seemingly minor actions like taking unauthorized photographs or leaving approved tourist areas. Cases of detained Americans, such as Otto Warmbier in 2016, serve as stark warnings for travelers. Diplomatic relations between the U.S. and North Korea remain strained, primarily due to North Korea's nuclear weapons program. The North Korean government views Americans with suspicion, considering them representatives of a hostile nation. Internet access and communication with the outside world are non-existent for tourists, adding to the isolation. The Demilitarized Zone (DMZ), a heavily fortified border between North and South Korea, symbolizes the ongoing tensions. Cultural sites such as the Juche Tower and the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun are off-limits without strict supervision. Tourism to North Korea involves significant ethical concerns, as much of the revenue supports the regime's policies. Human rights abuses within the country, including forced labor camps, further complicate the morality of visiting. Violating the U.S. travel ban by attempting to enter North Korea can lead to severe legal consequences upon return. For 2025, North Korea remains an inaccessible and risky destination, offering little hope for a change in policy. Country number 9. Iran is a land of rich history and culture, home to ancient Persian empires and stunning landmarks like Persepolis and the Nasir al-Mulk Mosque. Despite its breathtaking beauty, the strained diplomatic relations between Iran and the U.S. make it a challenging destination for American citizens. In 2025, Iran continues to impose strict visa restrictions, and obtaining permission to enter the country as an American is nearly impossible. Political tensions, fueled by disputes over sanctions, nuclear programs, and regional influence, have worsened the perception of Americans in Iran. Any American traveling to Iran is subject to intense scrutiny, with their movements closely monitored by local authorities. The risk of arbitrary detention is significant, as seen in several high-profile cases of Americans being accused of espionage. Anti-American sentiment is widespread in some areas, fueled by decades of political propaganda and media narratives. The country's strict dress codes, especially for women, pose additional challenges for American tourists unfamiliar with local customs. Financial systems in Iran are isolated from the U.S., rendering American credit cards and banking services unusable. Tourists must also contend with limited internet access and censorship, further isolating them during their visit. Despite these challenges, the Iranian people are known for their hospitality, creating a complex juxtaposition of warmth and political hostility. Americans are strongly advised to avoid discussing sensitive political topics while in the country to prevent misunderstandings. The absence of a U.S. embassy in Iran means that consular assistance in emergencies is almost non-existent. While Iran's cultural treasures are unparalleled, its political climate makes it one of the most challenging destinations for Americans in 2025. Until diplomatic relations improve, Iran remains largely off-limits for U.S. travelers. Country number 8. Venezuela, a country of immense natural beauty, boasts attractions like Angel Falls, the world's tallest waterfall, and the stunning Grand Sabana. Unfortunately, the country's ongoing political and economic crisis has made it one of the most dangerous places for American tourists. The U.S. State Department has issued a "Do Not Travel" advisory for Venezuela due to the high risk of crime and civil unrest. Violent crime, including armed robbery, carjacking, and kidnappings, is rampant, with Americans often targeted for ransom. Economic instability has led to shortages of basic goods, including food and medicine, making travel exceedingly difficult. Corruption within law enforcement means that foreign tourists have little recourse in the event of an incident. Relations between the U.S. and Venezuela remain deeply strained, largely due to disputes over governance and sanctions. The Maduro regime frequently uses anti-American rhetoric, further isolating U.S. citizens who visit. American tourists may find it challenging to access cash or use international banking services due to financial restrictions. Protests and political demonstrations are common and often turn violent, posing significant risks to visitors. Natural wonders like Los Roques Archipelago remain underutilized due to the country's instability. Healthcare infrastructure is in a dire state, leaving travelers vulnerable in the event of a medical emergency. U.S.-based airlines have significantly reduced or completely halted flights to Venezuela. Despite its untapped potential as a tourist destination, Venezuela's internal struggles keep it off limits for most Americans in 2025. Until safety and political conditions improve, Venezuela is an unviable option for U.S. travelers. Country number 7. Afghanistan is a nation of extraordinary natural beauty and historical significance, with sites like the Bamiyan Valley and the Minaret of Jam. However, decades of war and conflict have rendered it one of the most unstable countries in the world. The Taliban's return to power in 2021 has further complicated the situation, making it exceedingly dangerous for Americans. The U.S. government has issued the strongest travel advisories, warning against any non-essential travel to Afghanistan. Foreigners, particularly Americans, are at high risk of kidnapping, with insurgent groups often targeting Western visitors. The lack of a U.S. embassy in Kabul has left Americans with virtually no consular support in emergencies. Afghanistan's infrastructure remains underdeveloped, with limited access to reliable transportation and accommodations. Landmines and unexploded ordnance pose additional threats in rural and conflict-affected areas. The country's tribal regions are particularly dangerous for outsiders, with little oversight from central authorities. Despite these risks, Afghanistan's cultural heritage, including its ancient Silk Road history, continues to intrigue adventurers. Humanitarian workers and journalists are among the few Americans still traveling to Afghanistan, often under armed security. Natural disasters, such as earthquakes and floods, add another layer of unpredictability to travel in the region. The country's internal conflicts create frequent outbreaks of violence, even in previously stable areas. For Americans, Afghanistan is not just a travel challenge, but a high-risk destination requiring extensive caution. Until the political and security climate stabilizes, it remains inaccessible for U.S. tourists in 2025. Country number 6. Somalia, located in the Horn of Africa, is known for its stunning coastline along the Indian Ocean and its rich history as a center for trade. Unfortunately, it remains one of the most dangerous countries in the world due to ongoing armed conflict and lawlessness. The U.S. State Department has designated Somalia as a do-not-travel zone due to the high risk of terrorism, piracy, and violent crime. Armed militant groups like Al-Shabaab frequently target foreigners, including Americans, through bombings and kidnappings. There is little to no functioning government authority in many parts of the country, exacerbating safety concerns. Mogadishu, the capital, has seen sporadic attacks, even in supposedly secure zones, making it extremely risky for visitors. Americans traveling to Somalia are also at risk of maritime piracy, especially along the Gulf of Aden. Healthcare facilities in the country are extremely limited, and emergency medical evacuation is often the only option. Relations between Somalia and the U.S. are complicated, with ongoing counterterrorism operations creating resentment among locals. Travelers also face challenges related to inadequate infrastructure, such as poor road conditions and unreliable transportation. The U.S. Embassy in Mogadishu operates under heavy security, with minimal support available for American citizens. Cultural sites like Los Gil Caves remain out of reach due to the country's unstable security situation. Americans are strongly advised against visiting for tourism, as even organized humanitarian missions require intense precautions. Despite its cultural richness, Somalia's internal strife makes it nearly impossible for U.S. travelers to explore safely in 2025. Until there is significant improvement in security and governance, Somalia remains one of the least accessible destinations for Americans. Country number 5. Yemen, home to UNESCO World Heritage sites like Shirban and Socotra Island, boasts a unique cultural and natural heritage. However, the country has been engulfed in a devastating civil war since 2014, making it a dangerous destination for all foreigners. The U.S. government has issued a strict "do not travel" advisory for Yemen due to terrorism, civil unrest, and health risks. Armed groups, including Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliates, operate freely in many areas, targeting Westerners. American citizens are at high risk of kidnapping and violent attacks, particularly in regions outside the capital, Sana'a. The Saudi-led military intervention in Yemen has exacerbated the conflict, with frequent airstrikes and clashes on the ground. Yemen's healthcare system is in shambles, unable to handle basic medical needs, let alone emergencies. Famine and widespread poverty have created additional hazards for visitors, including severe shortages of food and clean water. Socotra Island, once a popular destination for adventure travelers, is now inaccessible due to the ongoing conflict. Infrastructure has been heavily damaged by the war, making transportation and accommodation unreliable or unavailable. There is no functioning U.S. embassy in Yemen, leaving Americans without consular support in case of emergencies. The conflict has made it impossible to access Yemen's historical sites, many of which have been damaged or destroyed. Anti-American sentiment is prevalent among certain factions, further endangering U.S. citizens who enter the country. Yemen's situation shows little sign of improvement in 2025, leaving it off-limits for American travelers. For Americans, Yemen remains a heartbreaking example of a beautiful country rendered inaccessible by war and instability. Country number 4. Libya, a North African country with a fascinating history, was once a popular destination for exploring Roman ruins like Leptis Magna. Since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, Libya has been in a state of chaos, with competing factions vying for control. The U.S. State Department warns against all travel to Libya due to the high risk of terrorism, kidnapping, and armed conflict. American travelers are particularly vulnerable to militant groups and criminal organizations seeking ransom payments. The security situation is unstable, with frequent clashes between rival militias even in major cities like Tripoli and Benghazi. Airports and borders are poorly regulated, adding to the risks for anyone attempting to enter the country. Libya's lack of a central government means there are no guarantees of safety or law enforcement. Oil-rich areas are frequent targets of attacks, further destabilizing the economy and infrastructure. Anti-American sentiment remains prevalent due to historical political tensions and U.S. military involvement in the region. Public services, including healthcare and utilities, are in a state of collapse, making travel extremely difficult. There is no functioning U.S. embassy in Libya, leaving Americans without consular support in emergencies. Natural sites like the Sahara Desert remain unexplored due to the persistent threat of violence. Americans traveling to Libya risk arbitrary detention by local authorities or militant groups. Libya's current political instability and security challenges make it inaccessible for U.S. travelers in 2025. Until a stable government is established, Libya's rich history and culture will remain out of reach for most Americans. Country number 3. Syria, a country with ancient cities like Damascus and Aleppo, is a historical treasure trove now ravaged by conflict. Since 2011, Syria has been embroiled in a devastating civil war, making it one of the most dangerous countries in the world. The U.S. government has issued a strict "do not travel" advisory, citing terrorism, armed conflict, and health risks. Foreigners, particularly Americans, are at high risk of kidnapping, with militant groups often targeting Westerners for propaganda purposes. Bombings and clashes between warring factions are common, even in areas previously considered safe. The Syrian regime and its allies often view American travelers with suspicion, adding another layer of risk. Healthcare infrastructure has been decimated, leaving visitors vulnerable in the event of medical emergencies. Historical sites like Palmyra have been damaged or destroyed by the war, further diminishing Syria's tourism appeal. U.S. citizens are strongly discouraged from visiting due to the lack of consular support within the country. Anti-American sentiment is fueled by U.S. involvement in the Syrian conflict, making Americans potential targets. Travel within Syria is severely restricted, with checkpoints and roadblocks controlled by various armed groups. Basic services like electricity and water are unreliable or unavailable in many parts of the country. The ongoing humanitarian crisis, including widespread displacement and poverty, compounds the risks for travelers. Syria's geopolitical significance ensures that its conflict remains a focal point of international tensions. In 2025, Syria continues to be a no-go zone for American travelers, despite its rich historical and cultural heritage. Country number 2. South Sudan, the world's youngest country, gained independence in 2011 but has been plagued by civil war and political instability. The U.S. State Department advises against all travel to South Sudan due to violent crime, armed conflict, and civil unrest. Americans face significant risks, including carjackings, shootings, and robberies, often targeting foreigners. Ongoing clashes between ethnic groups and political factions make many parts of the country inaccessible. Infrastructure in South Sudan is underdeveloped, with limited roads, accommodations, and communication facilities. Healthcare services are nearly non-existent, and medical emergencies require evacuation to neighboring countries. Flooding and other natural disasters exacerbate the country's already challenging conditions for travel. Anti-American sentiment is not widespread, but can arise in politically charged situations. The lack of a U.S. embassy in South Sudan leaves Americans without support in emergencies. Cultural landmarks and wildlife reserves, though stunning, remain underutilized due to the country's instability. Local armed groups and militia checkpoints create unpredictable and dangerous conditions for travelers. Despite the country's potential, South Sudan remains one of the least developed and most dangerous destinations in Africa. International aid workers often require armed escorts, highlighting the severity of the risks. For Americans, South Sudan is an incredibly high-risk destination in 2025, with little to no improvement in sight. Until peace and stability are achieved, South Sudan will remain off-limits for most U.S. travelers. Country number 1. Iraq, a nation steeped in history and home to ancient Mesopotamian civilizations, continues to grapple with instability in 2025. While parts of the country are rebuilding, security challenges persist, particularly in regions with ongoing insurgencies. The U.S. State Department advises against all travel to Iraq due to terrorism, kidnapping, and armed conflict. Americans are often targeted by extremist groups, making travel extraordinarily dangerous. Baghdad and other cities have improved infrastructure, but remain vulnerable to sporadic violence. The risk of bombings and attacks on public spaces poses a constant threat to locals and visitors alike. U.S. citizens are viewed with suspicion by some factions due to the history of U.S. military involvement. The U.S. Embassy in Baghdad operates under high security, limiting its ability to assist American citizens. Archaeological sites like Babylon and the Ziggurat of Ur remain difficult to access due to safety concerns. Traveling through Iraq requires navigating numerous checkpoints and heavily monitored areas. Healthcare facilities are operational in major cities, but are still recovering from years of conflict. Iraq's rich culture, including its cuisine and traditions, is overshadowed by its security challenges. Despite the risks, some adventurous travelers visit the Kurdish region, which is comparatively safer. For most Americans, however, Iraq remains a high-risk destination with significant obstacles to safe travel. Until the country achieves lasting peace and stability, Iraq will remain largely inaccessible for U.S. tourists. While these countries may be off-limits, remember that the world is vast and full of amazing places waiting to be explored. Always check travel advisories and understand the cultural and political landscape before planning your next adventure. Which of these surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more travel insights.